There is a place that is spoken about only in whispers, a dark area that spawns the beginnings of urban legends, a place where anything can happen and usually does. During the light of day, it hides just outside of view, but when the sun goes down, spirits, creatures of the night, roam free, and things do go bump in the night. It is in every state and every country, and there is no escaping it, no matter how safe you feel behind your locked doors and latched windows. So we invite you to turn down the lights and turn up your radio while we join Dave Schrader and Tim Dennis, your hosts, on a journey into the darkness on the edge of town.
Hello and welcome. It's Wednesday. You're tuned into the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Beyond the Darkness. I'm your host, Dave Schrader, along with me, Tim Dennis. You know, Tim, sometimes sitting in our ivory tower here in the glorious country that is Minnesota, I'm making it sound like we're our own entity in our sovereign state.
Yeah.
We forget about the little people around the world, Tim.
Well, yeah.
The issues that are striking the rest of the populace. And I'm saying this, all, of course, all in tongue-in-cheek and sarcastic, but you do forget what's gone on in other places when it's not out your back door.
Oh, of course.
And, you know, we look at the issues that we have here in snow and rain and ice and things, but, you know, I would rather deal with that than the weather that's hit Puerto Rico.
In a minute.
Tsunami weather and hurricanes and horrific things like that have destroyed places like Puerto Rico and parts of our own country here that have just taken a beating,
right,
a drubbing from these horrific storms. But one of the guys who's always a part of the mix, and he's always out there reporting and testing and looking to the skies to see what's going on, is our buddy Joshua P. Warren. And for the first time since Hurricane Maria ravaged Puerto Rico, Josh is back with us to give us a live report from the island, including what he calls is a plethora of breaking weird stories surrounding an event that we've never heard of before. And he's also going to unveil a new system he's developed to help with you hacking reality by matching your personality type with a method that works for you. This is our guest, ladies and gentlemen, Joshua P. Warren. Welcome back to the show, Josh.
Hey, thank you, Dave. Always wonderful to be with you, my friend.
Now, you are out in Puerto Rico where you own and operate the Bermuda Triangle Research Center, just to remind people. And Josh Warren is an investigator. He pioneers the amazing relationship between the mind, energy, matter, and strange phenomena. He's reported with us for many years here on the show. It's always a great pleasure to have you back. Talk to me a little bit about Hurricane Maria and just what it left in its devastating wake.
Yeah, well, you know, I have been down I've been coming here to Puerto Rico for probably like 12, 13 years. And over the past 5 years, I've been here a lot because of operating this research base. I left, fortunately, just a few weeks before the hurricanes hit, and then I just got back here about 10 days ago. I guess it's been about 2 weeks ago now. And so, you know, it's been of great concern what I was going to find. And just to clarify for everyone, last September, this island was hit by two hurricanes. First, there was Irma that hit on September 6th. It was a Category 5, but it only hit part of the island. And the big one, Maria, hit 2 weeks later, and that was the one that went right across the island and really tore it all to pieces. And that also was most likely a Category 5, but it was so powerful it destroyed the weather radar, and so we don't have a lot of good, clear data. In fact, that weather radar still has not been replaced. So even now, some of the weather imaging from Puerto Rico is pretty wishy-washy. So when I got back here and started driving around the island, you can imagine that I was very relieved to find that it looked much better than I was expecting. Now, granted, it has been 5 months, and I first off saw the land looks beautiful. The land is recovered very well, and I haven't been all over the island, but I've been over about half of it. The people are bustling and thriving. All the businesses are open. There is still a lot of there are so many problems with the power grid. As a matter of fact, today the power has been out all day long here at my condo up until about an hour ago. So as you're driving around the island, most of the traffic lights don't work. There are still power poles that are splintered or down, a lot of drooping power lines on the side of the road. Roadsides are gone or twisted all to pieces. And here at my condo, I do not have cable or internet, but I do have power most of the time, and I've got these hot spots that I'm using to communicate with the outside world. So I feel very blessed that everything else here on my property was fine. My friends have all done well. I will tell you, however, that you may recall, Dave, at one point, I guess early last year, I put a live webcam up on an observation deck overlooking one of the bays here to search for these UFOs and objects that I call OUFOs. Well, that observation deck was completely destroyed. It's just splinters. So I did lose some equipment, but for the most part, I feel we were very blessed here, and I just hope this place does not get hit by another hurricane, because the hurricane season is going to be kicking back in again pretty soon.
At least you haven't resorted to eating human flesh yet.
Well, I haven't been up into the mountains. That is where things get really scary, because people do not realize that the terrain is so rugged here. There is this spine of mountains that goes through the island, and those mountains are over 4,000 feet tall. And so even when the weather was really nice, you drive up into the mountains and you would find areas where these really narrow roads were caving off into these ravines and canyons. You'd have landslides and mudslides. I mean, people were already kind of living like pioneers back up in there. And so I think, as time goes on, we're still going to find people who are just devastated living up in those mountains, who've been unable to get out to the or communicate with the outside world. So there is still a lot to be done here. And, it's funny because the media was inundated with all of these reports about the tragedy here and the government response and all that kind of stuff. But you never heard anything about the paranormal activity surrounding the event. So I started hearing reports even before I came back here about a lot of strange activity that was happening before, during, and after this hurricane that nobody else is reporting or even knows about.
All right. Well, if you've got all this activity taking place that was leading up to the storm, do you think that's because the electromagnetic charge of the storm building up that was bringing it to a head, or what? I mean, talk me through the science of why there was something prior to the storm.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right on target there. It reminds me so much of these harbingers like Mothman, who appeared before the collapse of the Silver Bridge in 1967. And let me point out that growing up in the Carolinas, I was always intrigued by these stories going back hundreds of years about a ghost called the Gray Man, who would appear on the Carolina coast just before a hurricane. Especially in this one area called Pawleys Island, which is between Charleston and Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Now, you got to realize that hundreds of years ago, we had no warning system for these devastating hurricanes. We didn't start putting weather radar out there until the 1960s. So it was invaluable to have some kind of a sign, whether you understood it or not, that would give you a heads up when something paranormal or something tragic was about to happen. And so this Gray Man is sort of this wispy, misty form that would appear kind of wandering the beaches most often just before one of these would hit. He started appearing in the early 1800s. There was a very well-confirmed sighting in 1822, right before a major hurricane that's on the history books. And it's believed that this guy was a resident of the area who was traveling through one of the marshy areas when a hurricane had hit and created this sort of quicksand that they call pluff mud. And he got stuck in it and drowned, and or suffocated, I guess is what you'd say. And so since then, he has shown up to warn people just before this happens. So I was always aware of this kind of thing, which continues to this day. In fact, the Weather Channel did a really interesting program about this. And they had some residents there, Jim and Clara Moore, who saw this being as late as 1989. So anyway, when I came back to Puerto Rico, I started hearing about these types of things, and I'll start with them beforehand. Now, again, we call these harbingers. You got two types. Sometimes you have a harbinger like the gray man, which seems to be a positive thing. Like if you see the gray man, he gives you a heads up, you can get out of there. And most people find that they are protected after they see the gray man. Then you have those people who have the opposite experience. They see a harbinger of doom. And when that happens, you may as well just get your affairs in order because you're probably not going to make it. And so we have both types that have been seen here. So what I'd like to do is just sort of go down a list and tell you about some of these things that were happening one after the other. Does that sound good?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so for one thing, the Puerto Ricans in Spanish, they call these storms tormentas. So that tells you a lot about the reality of living through one of these things. And for years, you may recall, going back at least almost 10 years, I have told you on this radio show, I'm pretty sure at least once, that I would interview people around the island about weird things that they just couldn't quite categorize. And often I would talk to people who would wake up in the middle of the night. It was usually a couple, man and woman. They'd wake up in the middle of the night with this large ball of light just sort of hovering at the foot of their bed.
Right.
And, of course, they were petrified with fear. Who wouldn't be? And then this sound would emerge from the ball of light. And sometimes to one person, usually the woman, the sound would be just sort of like a recording played in fast forward, like it wouldn't make any sense. But the other person, usually the man, would hear a voice that came from the ball of light that sounded very much like just a human speaking. It could be Spanish, it could be English, and it would always say the same kind of thing. It would say something big is going to happen soon on this island, but do not be afraid. You will be okay. You will be protected, and then it will disappear. So I talked to 11 people who'd had that experience over the years, never knowing what it meant. Since the hurricane, I have been able to get in touch with 4 of those people, and so far all of those people have told me that their homes were unscathed, even though many of the places around them were severely damaged. So that could be something that's been happening for years in reference to this hurricane. Furthermore, speaking specifically of Mothman, there is a being here that's very much like Mothman called the Gargula. Now, the Gargula has been seen for off and on for about 5 or 6 years in this little town called Ensenada, which is a part of a larger area called Guanica. He is literally a life-size, man-sized gargoyle. He is about 6 feet tall, has a face of kind of like a Doberman Pinscher, large, black, leathery sort of bat wings. He walks slightly hunched and has been seen flying around the community and also on foot. And I actually talked face-to-face. I swear to God, I talked face-to-face to 5 different active duty police officers who have all seen this. This is not a joke. They have chased this thing around with guns, and they've gotten the hounds out and done everything they could trying to find this thing. Usually, the Gargula appears around November or December. Nobody knows why. But last year, all that was different. There was this flap of Gargula sightings right before the hurricane started hitting, right around late August. A very strange and uncustomary. And so this may again be some kind of a Mothman-type harbinger event because, as you were saying, Dave, before something like this hurricane happens, there's an incredible buildup of energy. And, in fact, a lot of the Puerto Ricans here, they believe that hurricanes are living things. These are living entities that are often just sort of upset and come through and tear the place apart. And it's funny because I talked to a man. I've known him quite a while now. He's 51 years old. He's lived here, has not left this island since 1975. And he said he's seen numerous hurricanes come and go. However, he said this one was different. Before Maria hit, he said there was this absolute eerie, quiet, and stillness and calmness like he'd never seen. And all the animals just disappeared except for these big buzzards circling overhead, very ominously, of course. And then you have this eruption. And it's funny because the animals here in particular are so sensitive. You know, have you ever lived anywhere where iguanas run wild, Dave?
No, and I hope never to.
never been asked that question.
No.
Well, there are iguanas all over this island, you know, and the iguanas, they love to hang out in the tops of trees, which is pretty weird. They're very good climbers. And so if you're unfortunate enough to be walking through the jungle when one of these things, snoozes, you might find some big iguana clawing its way down landing on your head. But nonetheless, these iguanas, they usually like to sleep or hang out perched on the limb with their faces outward. And so people have learned to predict the weather by watching the iguanas. They say when the iguana faces outward, the weather is going to be pleasant. But if he turns around and faces the trunk of the tree, it's going to start raining within a day. And they're just so sensitive to the temperature and the pressure. So anyway, you have all these kinds of things that you would expect, but then it gets even more specific. I talked to a man named Juan Carlos who lives on the northern side of the island that sustained a lot of damage. It's not too far from the town of Arecibo where they have the big radio satellite dish. And there's a gigantic cave system there called the Kamui Caves. And whenever people come to visit here in Puerto Rico, I take them to the Kamui Caves because they're just so impressive. And those caves were not rediscovered in the modern era until 1960-something. It's amazing. So the archaeologists have determined that the Taínos, the indigenous peoples here, they would understandably go to these caves in order to seek shelter when these big storms were approaching. And now, the whole thing is just it's commercial. It's a park, and it's very well protected, and nobody's allowed to be there outside of business hours. But all these residents around the Kamui Caves said that for 2 nights before the storm, the dogs would start barking outside, and they'd open the door, and they would hear this sort of chilling moaning that was coming from the caves. It sounded like hundreds of people just wailing and moaning, and they say it would make your blood run cold. And everybody knew, these are people who lived there for decades, knew there was no explanation for this sound coming from the caves. And then, of course, that particular area was hit so hard. A lot of people died. There were lots of injuries. Many of the houses were completely destroyed. And then you have, that we consider that a harbinger of doom, right? Well, but here's another story about what ended up being a more positive harbinger, I think similar to the Gray Man. I talked to this lady named Walinda, who lives in this little town called Hormigueros. And Hormigueros is about a 10-minute drive north of where I am right now. So it's just sort of a little residential community. And whenever a hurricane is about to hit, the governor orders the banning of all alcohol sales for 24 hours up to that and until everything's clear. And so that kind of forces everybody to go home and to batten down the hatches and get their property ready. And it's a spooky, unpleasant time. A lot of people already have lost their power because of some of the strong winds that might be coming ahead of one of these storms. So it's a time when people are really paying attention to their property and what's around them. So Walinda said that she was preparing her house, and this was about 8:30 at night, so it was dark, and she noticed a large white object outside of her window. So she opens the door, steps outside, and here is this woman with, as she described it, dark skin, wearing a white hood and white cloak or similar type garb, standing there at the edge of her yard. Now, this was a very unexpected and unusual sight. So Walinda went walking over toward the woman. The woman looked right at her and then completely disappeared. Just boom, gone in the blink of an eye. It freaked Walinda out so much that she went back into her house, locked the doors, started calling people and told a lot of people about this. Well, when the hurricane came through the next day, all the houses around hers were torn to bits, but it's one of those where hers was miraculously unscathed. Now, when she told me this story, I found it particularly amazing because I knew something that even Melinda did not know, and that is, in that same town in 1604, there was an 8-year-old girl named Maria Montserrat, and she disappeared for 2 weeks. So the entire community was out searching desperately for her, and they gave up hope, really. And then one day they heard a little girl sort of whispering a tune, and they found this little girl sitting in a big hole at the base of this huge tree called the ceiba tree. And everyone was laughing and crying and couldn't believe it. And they said, "What happened to you?" And she said that she had gotten lost, but that every night a beautiful woman dressed in white with skin the color of coffee would come to give her food and care, and they considered this an angel. And to this day, among historians, that incident is known as the miracle of Ormagueros. So this is something that's very similar to what was happening hundreds of years ago that residents didn't even know about. Now that, of course, is more of a harbinger of hope and protection, which I think again is closer to the gray man. I'll leave you with one more story before we have to take a break, I'm sure. Here's another one that's unfortunate. In 1840, there was this old plantation, a sugar mill hacienda near San Juan, and the owners there worked their slaves really hard. They were very bad. And the master would ring a bell throughout the day to signify when it was time to wake up or to eat or to sleep or whatever. So for decades, even after that plantation and the bell were long gone, people have heard that bell ringing in the night just before some kind of tragedy strikes. It doesn't have to be a natural disaster. It could be the unexpected death of a family member or a big fire or something. And so it's always been believed that it's the spirits of the slaves sort of exacting some revenge. Well, I went to that area and I met with numerous groups of people at these little restaurants/bars called chinchorros that you find sort of strewn throughout the landscape. And everybody I walked in and talked to in this area said that for a few nights before Maria hit, they would hear this bell ringing. Now, mind you, this bell doesn't exist anymore, but it has this sort of shrill sound, and they could clearly hear it in that peaceful time leading up to the hurricane. And when that hurricane hit, guess what? Just about everybody in that community had homes that at least sustained a great deal of damage. Many people were injured. Some family members died. So we would think of that as a harbinger of doom. So there are more and more of these things we can talk about, including sightings of UFOs and OUFOs and other weird kinds of craft. But that gives you sort of a gist, a tip of the iceberg of some of the things here surrounding this major tragedy, the worst hurricane to ever hit this island in recorded history.
Let me ask you, Josh, before we break, a couple questions on some of the stories you regaled us with. You were talking about the orb of light that would appear in people's rooms, and these voices would come from this light. Were the voices spoken voices, or would it be safer to say more like a telepathic message that was coming through?
Well, yeah, everybody that I talked to had the impression that it was literally audible, that if you'd had a tape recorder in the room, you would have been able to record it. But just because they perceived it that way doesn't mean that was the case, because, again, you have two different people there who are both telling you that they heard two different things. So if you had the tape recorder, which one of those versions would have been picked up? Or maybe a whole new different version. So that makes you think that maybe this was more telepathic, but the people perceived it as being no different than some almost divine being standing there speaking right to them and the vibrations entering their ears.
I also wonder, when you hear reports like this, And if you haven't gotten to this aspect yet, perhaps in the future you can bring this up. When these voices are coming through, do they end up sounding transmitted? Like, you could tell the difference between a spoken voice or one that's coming over a radio frequency or a broadcast over a phone, or megaphone, speaker, things like that. There's a difference, because I've heard some similar stories of these light emanations where they're hearing voices from within, but it sounds almost, sometimes they'll hear like a static and a crackle and a pop before the messages come through.
I'm really glad that you're bringing this up, because you're absolutely right. The people who would hear this sort of ball of light speaking, they always gave the impression that it sounded very organic. But there is a man I interviewed named Michael Rivera, and he is one of a number of people who have had this, but I think he's the best case. I actually spent the night at his house for about 3 or 4 nights trying to have this experience that he was having, where he had this disembodied voice that would speak to him, and it would always have this kind of electromagnetic, electrostatic kind of artificial sound. It kind of reminds me a little bit of how Indrid Cold was represented in the movie The Mothman Prophecies.
Right.
And it was really, really freaking him out. He believed that it was the devil in his house, because he was a very religious man. He would sort of make sense of things via the lens of his religion. And so he literally was trying to get this thing, like exorcised. And so I spent a lot of time at his house taking recordings, and I was never able to adequately document what he felt he was so clearly hearing. But I will tell you a couple things. For one, his house is right within an area where electromagnetic broadcasts were being sent from the Arecibo Project's HARP division, which that's a whole other topic we can get into. HARP is a very controversial technology, and there is a HARP outpost here in Puerto Rico, and those kinds of waves can affect your brain. But furthermore, if you look at something like the Gargula, and you combine that with these other things I'm telling you, then you'd say, hell yeah, there's a devil here. And in fact, if anybody listening, I hope if you go to my website, joshuapwarren.com, there is no period after the P. If you go to joshuapwarren.com and you scroll down to the bottom of the homepage, there is actually a photograph that someone took that they claim is a picture of the Gargula. Now, frankly, I don't know if this is authentic or not. It looks pretty fishy to me, but this will give you an idea of what people are saying they're seeing. So I want you to imagine if you had some kind of disembodied voice speaking inside your house, and you had this thing running around and flying around in the sky outside, you'd probably think that the gates of hell had opened and some kind of demon was coming through as well.
If you've got HARP there, why are they not using or utilizing that that seems like a deflector array. Why weren't they using that to push off something like Maria or any of the major tropical storms that befall Puerto Rico?
Well, this is sad to even speculate on this, because it's sinister, but there are plenty of people who have talked to me and who have contacted me through email and whatnot who believe it's just the opposite, that there are powers that intentionally drew this hurricane to cause this destruction at this time. Now, you might say, why in the world would anybody want to do that? Well, there are actually some surprisingly good reasons. For one thing, yes, we know that there are hurricanes that naturally come through the Caribbean anyway, but HARP would make it very easy to sort of tap into that and magnify it and direct it. I mentioned that the weather satellite was knocked out here. It's called a NEXRAD, Next Generation Radar. And I had this guy who contacted me, and he goes, just out of curiosity, he says, did the hurricane happen to pass directly over top of the NEXRAD system? And I went and I looked, and I said, yeah, it did. And he says, there is a pattern of this happening. And he starts showing me all these overlays from New Orleans, from Sandy and New Jersey, and all these other occasions when it just so happens these hurricanes go right over those radar systems. And I said to him, I was like, well, what do we conclude from this? And he says, these weather radar systems are an outpost of the HARP outposts, and that these things can not only passively pick up information, but they are also actively sending out information which could be used to change the path of these things. And so technically, I could see where he was coming from. Now, why one would want to do that? Well, for one thing, Puerto Rico has been in the news for years now because of their extreme financial problems. I mean, just a money pit that was getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And the island just, declared bankruptcy, recently. I mean, this island is out of money. So you have all these people out there, especially on Wall Street and whatnot, who had investments here, and they were not going to get any kind of money from their investments because nobody here had money to give them. And therefore, the only way you might be able to get some of your money back is to have a giant natural disaster come in here that cleans out the island so severely that we get FEMA now coming in with all of these other government organizations and all this taxpayer money, billions and billions of dollars of it, which then gets distributed through all this ambiguous organization here on the island. Since it's not a state, it's just a territory. And some of that money could find its way back to some of these people who essentially own the island, because that's what this is. It's a possession. And so that would be one possible conspiracy. There's another one. Do you want me to get into that now or hold off?
No, go ahead. We might as well wrap up with that one before we go to break.
Well, this one is even more bizarre and harder to believe. But it is well known that this island has secret military bases strewn all over it, which is why I always use the word secret in quotations, because we all know they're there. It's kind of a red flag when there's a sign that says we'll shoot you if you walk over here, And so the military has been doing experiments here going back certainly 100 years or more, biological experiments on humans and animals. They were taking Puerto Rican women and testing eugenics and sterilization and all that. They have done all kinds of bombing experimentations and in places where people live, like this little island called Vieques. I could go on and on and on. So this island has all these military operations, and it also has this huge amount of UFO and USO type activity and these things that I call OUFOs flying around. And many people have believed for years that the government, or at least the military installations here, are working with these beings, with these aliens. Some even believe and have some very detailed stories about the idea that these aliens disguise themselves sometimes as humans, but they never get it quite right. They're always a little awkward. So anyway, let's say this is true. Let's say that we have this military presence here with all these underground bases and stuff, and they're even working with these aliens or interdimensionals or whatever you want to call them. Once in a while, they're going to need to go in and update their own infrastructure, update their bases, update their technology. And in this day and age, when everybody's running around with a cell phone and we have, satellite imagery, it's going to look weird if you have these massive troops of people coming in here reconstructing things. But if you have a hurricane that comes through that just destroys everything, it makes it very, very easy in the midst of all this chaos for them to come in, cordon off areas, and do whatever construction they want to and say, oh yeah, we're just making repairs after the hurricane. Go have a pina colada. Move along, folks. There's nothing to see here. And so it could be a very convenient and necessary evil for them to go in and update their own infrastructure under the guise of it being hurricane efforts or hurricane restoration efforts. So this gets really bizarre and complicated, but this might also explain why there's been a big uptick in sightings of weird craft and weird machines on this island since the hurricane, which, by the way, on my website there, if you scroll down, you'll also see a very weird photograph of one of these objects that has appeared recently, and I'll be happy to talk more about that when we come back.
Beyond the darkness.
Welcome back. This is the best in paranormal talk radio. Beyond the Darkness is on the air. You can find us here 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Make sure to check out the show. Share it with your friends, relatives, neighbors, co-workers, worst possible enemies. We want them all to know about the show. We're talking with our friend Joshua P. Warren, who's out in Puerto Rico, talking about the strange paranormal happenings that have taken place prior to and during and after the hurricanes that have struck the island, pummeling it. I'm curious, Josh, with all of the activity of UFOs that are seen over that property and the way that the energy seems to have changed and shifted there, do you think that there could be, especially you've got that large radio broadcaster there, you've got the large radio antenna, is there a chance that this area is a weakened pocket because it is where UFO craft are entering our airspace, our dimension, whatever you want to refer to it as? Could that be causing kind of a magnetic pull effect towards this bad weather?
I think that also is a really astute observation, Dave, because, I have been pointing out for years that there is something that is just naturally special about this spot on planet Earth that we call the Bermuda Triangle. And most people who just come into contact with that term casually, they only think of it in terms of disappearances of ships and planes and all that. But of course, that's just one small facet of this. There is a whole phantasmagoria of bizarre things that are kind of focused onto this part of the world. And when I first came down here and started trying to figure out, what makes this area special, I realized that most people who are doing paranormal investigation work, they're running around out there with electromagnetic field meters, possibly electrostatic meters. They might have Geiger counters. They've got night vision and infrared and thermal and all that. But very few people are actually looking at gravity. And if you go to Google and you just type in NASA gravity maps, you'll see a color-coded map of Earth, and it illustrates the inconsistency of Earth's gravitational field. So, in other words, places where it's weaker usually are colored blue, and then places where it's stronger are colored orange or red. And so if you look at this entire section that we call the Bermuda Triangle, the gravity is so weak here that the blue is bluer than blue. You can't even see the island of Puerto Rico on the map because the gravity is so weak here. The terrain is also very dramatic because, as I mentioned, you have these mountains that are over 4,000 feet high, but then you just go several miles off the coast, and there's this incredible drop-off called the Puerto Rico Trench, which is the deepest point in the Atlantic Ocean, the second deepest point on Earth. This trench is almost 30,000 feet deep. So you could take Mount Everest and slip it down in there and just have the tip of the mountain sticking up. So here you have this area with very weak gravity that also seems to align with all of these events. On the other hand, if you go to places on Earth that have strong gravity, you find a lot of the sacred sites and pyramids and temples. And I wondered why this might be, and I realized, well, okay, wackos like you and myself, we like to go out and just wade right into all this freaky and scary paranormal activity. But ancient people did not like that. They wanted to stay away from that stuff. And so it would make sense that they would avoid places that had more paranormal activity, like these places that have a weak gravitational field. But they would go to places where there was less activity. For some unknown reason, they would consider them to be a protected zone, and then they would build their churches and temples and that sort of thing there. This is one of the theories that I'm sort of working toward, but I need to do a much more detailed cross-reference. So it could be that, as you were suggesting, Dave, this area really is some kind of what ancient Europeans would call a thin place, meaning that we know there are many, many different dimensions just based upon the math that our brilliant scientists have given us alone. And thus, if we have all these dimensions around us, but we're not usually able to access them so easily, places like this, maybe because of that weakened gravitational field, could create a kind of a window that allows these things to sort of pop more easily in and out. But in the same way that we have this kind of interdimensional weather where things get caught up and vanish, you also have this represented on the atmospheric level, which is why you have, of course, hurricanes and even tornadoes and that sort of thing, because it's all part of this tumultuous sort of layered effect that we have here on Earth that maybe starts with the physical things that we can see right in front of us, like weather currents and all that, but it extends also to these more invisible realms where these things can utilize that space as an interface to sort of pop in and out of our dimension.
There was a lot said that Bermuda Triangle was possibly dealing with these belches of gas that were coming up from the ocean floor, which would quickly overturn a boat, disrupt an airplane, cause crashes, things like that. If they look at that, can that also have an impact on the environment of storms? Having that kind of a violent push from the earth coming up in a gas form and hitting different layers of temperatures, would that possibly be part of what's causing such a dynamic weather pattern over that area as well?
Well, the idea of the methane gas discharge bringing down boats or even airplanes is certainly plausible and has been recreated under very stringent, well-controlled lab conditions. The problem is when you start talking to geologists who specialize in this area, and I happen to be very fortunate because a friend of mine is a geologist who works with the United Nations and has traveled all over this area as well as Africa, etc. The professional geologists will say there is no evidence whatsoever that there has been any significant discharge of methane gas in this area in over 15,000 years. And there was one woman who is a professor at a university, I forget which one, who put out even a press release last year saying that she had studied that issue in particular and that she was considering it debunked, that there is and of course we're not talking about people who are advocating for some other kind of weirdo paranormal theory like I do, but they are at least coming out saying that scientifically the methane one, no pun intended, just doesn't hold any water.
All right. Well, I was just curious about if there was any future or further research and analysis done on something like that. Do you believe, though, if there is these kind of belches of it and they're saying that it's environmental, couldn't it be more along the lines of these USO bases, possible USO bases that are believed to be in that area?
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the most amazing images, and I always love sending people to my main website, joshuapwarren.com, but I'm going to throw another one out here because of such a great image that's on it. If you go to areciboproject.com, there is a photograph that comes from NOAA imagery, and it shows the underground foundation, or excuse me, the underwater foundation of Puerto Rico. And especially right off of the south of the island, it looks so much like there is an artificial structure there. It's very difficult to believe that it could be something natural. And so, these craft that go in and out of the water are these are more than just the product of anecdotes. I put out a video report last year called Oh UFOs, A New Discovery, and you can find that also on my website if you click on the news section. And in this report, I started by showing some footage that was captured by Homeland Security in 2014, I believe, in Aguadilla, Puerto Rico, which was at an airport. It's called the Aguadilla Airport. I fly in and out of there all the time. And there is this object that's zipping around at 120 miles per hour. It doesn't have a rotor. It doesn't have wings. It has no visible means of propulsion. And they're documenting this on thermal cameras. And this thing flies around the airport, completely dismissive of any kind of security. They had to ground all the flights. And the Homeland Security camera follows this thing as it bobs in and out of the water. And, I mean, it goes seamlessly into the water. You can see it traveling 90 miles per hour just under the surface of the water. And then finally, it comes out of the water, and now it's joined by a second object. And those two objects sort of bounce in and out of the water, and then they go down and they disappear into the ocean for good. And this footage has been studied over and over and authenticated over and over. A group of mainstream scientists wrote a 162-page report that is the most thorough report of its kind I've ever seen, validating this footage and everything within it. Plus, I mean, I remember I was here when this happened, and the buzz on the island from people who worked at that airport or worked at the Homeland Security office. I mean, they couldn't keep it a secret. It was so exciting. So that said, when you look at these objects, they are weird because they don't necessarily look like the old traditional flying saucer. Sometimes they have a more shape-shifting type of an appearance, which may be how they are able to so seamlessly transition from the air to the water and vice versa. That may be something about their fabric or their composition, if you will, is able to just morph in milliseconds to adjust to whatever medium they're moving through. So that said, sometimes when you see these objects around here, they look very freaky because they don't fit what you're expecting to see, even if you're looking for UFOs, which is why I mentioned on my website, if you scroll down the homepage, you'll see a picture there that I just posted. And this is a photograph taken by a good friend of mine who is an investigator here. He's a native. His name is Ellis. And Ellis is one of these guys who likes to sit around with these big, long telephoto lenses and stuff and take pictures of these secret bases from afar. And there is an airstrip nearby that officially doesn't exist, but everybody in the area, you know, they know it's there. You can drive by and you can see the windsocks and the weather instruments and stuff. And he said that right after the hurricane, all this military came in, all the FEMA type people came in, and then there also was this big flap of sightings of these weird aircraft. So he was sitting there and he was taking pictures of this airstrip. And in his first picture, you can see what just looks like a little airplane sitting there. But then a few seconds later, there is this object that has appeared behind the airplane. And it looks really weird. It's like a big, tall, dark structure with some kind of a rod, and it looks like some sort of appendages. And nobody's sure what this thing is that just sort of appears all of a sudden. And yet, if you compare that picture to another photograph that a scientist I know named Louis Imott took in 2012, he captured something flying over top of a herd of cattle that has, in many people's opinion, a very similar appearance. It's one of these dark, weird-shaped objects that looks like it's got some sort of appendages around it. And we're not talking about misinterpreting bugs or birds or any of those things. I always want to make it clear that everybody understands, as a person who does this kind of research professionally, I have gone out for 25-plus years, and I have photographed birds and insects and rain and snow and everything you can imagine with every type of camera, every type of shutter speed, under every type of condition, so that I can very easily tell the difference. And these are objects that just cannot be explained as anything normal, and that's even enhanced by some of the footage that I have gotten in the past, where we have sent out transmissions inviting these things to appear, and they will show up, sometimes right there on command, show up on camera, on video, and then shoot right back up into the sky while making this weird kind of whistling sound. So these things that are flying around here, they're obviously moving in and out of the water because there's something down there. And we don't know just how extensive it is. But even if you just talk to fishermen who've been out there fishing their whole lives, they'll tell you they've seen plenty of just good old-fashioned submarines out there traveling around as well. So there's a lot going on underground here, and when you're dealing with the military, it's secret, and that secrecy reached a peak in the Cold War, but it's still secret to this day.
Are there any cutoff seasons for catching a submarine?
Any cutoff seasons?
You said all the fishermen are out there and they'll see full-on submarines. I'm just wondering if there's ever a cutoff season when you're not allowed to net for submarines. That's got to be a little intimidating, right? You're just out trying to do some fishing and a submarine goes bubbling underneath you.
Well, it freaks them out.
I would guess.
Well, it's like here one of the most interesting stories that I've heard, and it's kind of. Sometimes you feel tongue-in-cheek when you're telling stories about talking to old fishermen because everybody knows old fishermen have their fish tails. But I talked to this 84-year-old man who has been a fisherman literally his whole life. His father was a fisherman, and so when this kid was 4 years old, he was on the boat, helping his dad. And this guy, the only time he'd left the island was he served in the military. I think it was in the 1950s or around that period of time. He got involved with a group of Army scientists who would go to places like Hiroshima and take measurements years after to see what the effects were of radiation. So this was a smart guy, and I was sitting there, and he had a very clear, sharp mind. And I was asking him if he'd ever seen anything, weird or paranormal or whatever after being out on these waters his whole life. And he said, only once did I see something that shocked me that I absolutely could not explain. After 84 years, he said, only one time. I said, well, what did you see? And he lives in a little village called La Parguera, which is part of a larger area called Lajas. And La Parguera, it's got, little pescaterias was what they call them, which are fresh fish markets, and people come from all over the island to go buy this guy's fish. And he said that, the most valuable fish here on the island throughout the years has usually been the red snapper. And so these fishermen will go out at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning to catch these red snapper. That's the ideal time, and sometimes you have to go many, many miles off the coast, sometimes as much as 20 miles if you find a sweet spot where a bunch of them hang out. So these guys are very used to being out there by themselves at night on the water. And so he said that there was this one area south of La Parguera called Isla Cueva, where he used to go, and he would have a lot of success catching fish. And he'd go out there by himself. And I believe he said this was in the early 1990s, that 4 o'clock in the morning, he said he was the only thing around. He didn't see any other boats. It's just him by himself out there in the darkness in the middle of the ocean. And this, by the way, is very close to a zone that is restricted. So if you go out with some of these fishermen, they'll pull out their official nautical maps, and they'll show you areas that are designated as restricted zones. Like you cannot come into this area off the coast that's owned by the government, blah, 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 And so he was pretty close to one of those areas. And anybody who knows Puerto Rico, you can look that up. Isla Cueva, just south of Lajas. So anyway, here he is, 4 o'clock in the morning. And his eyes are all nicely adjusted to the dark. He's rocking up and down. He's at ease. And all of a sudden, boom, something jarring happens. There is this bright green light that turns on underneath his boat. So that in and of itself was very freaky because he'd never seen that. So he says he looks down into the water, and the first thing that came to his mind is there must be a submarine or something down here. So he's looking down, and the water's very, very clear in that area. And so he saw all this sort of distortion and some bubbles, and this light gets brighter and brighter and brighter, and his heart's racing and racing and racing. And all of a sudden, just a few feet away from his boat, this beautiful saucer with green lights all around it comes blasting up out of the water with, you can imagine foam and materials sort of just dripping off it, and shoots straight up into the sky and disappears. And this guy, you can imagine what he almost relieved himself, at that point. And so he immediately was so freaked out that he just got out of there. It was a total fight or flight response. And he made his way very quickly back and said that he never went out to that spot again. It was so freaky for him. So this is a guy who could have sat there and he could have told me crazy stories all day long, and I would have been fascinated and I'd be happy to repeat them. But he said, nope. Only once did I see something, and he described it so vividly, I could almost see the hair standing up on his arms as he was reliving that experience.
Such an amazing place, so much activity focused in one area. There's obviously a reason they put the Arecibo radio receiver there.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's got to be something going on with that.
There's a lot of interesting conspiracy and controversy about Arecibo, which Arecibo was put there in the dish was put there in the 1960s. It was the largest radio satellite dish in the world up until a couple of years ago when the Chinese built one that's bigger. But so it's the second biggest. So this dish is 1,000 feet in diameter. And you've probably seen it in movies, like the movie Contact with Jodie Foster or the James Bond movie GoldenEye. And the original purpose of this was just to be a gigantic ear that would listen to these very faint signals that would come from the cosmos and try to image them so that you might be able to see a layer that's otherwise invisible out there in space. Very successful. But in 1993, the HARP project was created in Alaska. And I believe HARP is an acronym for like the High Altitude Auroral Research Project or High Active Auroral Research Project, something like that. What they're doing at HARP is they are not sitting there and passively listening. They're doing the opposite. They are transmitting enormous amounts of energy. Many hundreds of thousands of watts, maybe millions of watts in some cases, we don't know, onto these very small sections of the ionosphere. And the ionosphere, of course, is one of the lower levels of the magnetosphere. The ionosphere is very important for the technology of traditional broadcasting because you're usually trying to bounce signals off of the ionosphere, and that's why at night you can pick up stations that are much farther away than you can during the day. That's because at night the magnetosphere expands, it lifts the ionosphere, and so these transmissions can bounce off at a different angle and they can go farther distance. So when HARP was put together by the Navy and the University of Alaska and DARPA, it made sense when they said, we are just trying to improve communications. We're just experimenting with transmissions. That's it. And we all know why the Navy would especially be involved. They're involved in a lot of stuff, but especially trying to communicate with submarines. That's a huge challenge to get signals reliably down to these submarines through all that water. So the problem is when you start messing around with the ionosphere, no matter what your original intention is, you're going to create side effects. And one of those is being able to deflect beams that can heat up certain parts of the Earth's surface. And when you do that, you can manipulate weather. Another thing that you might do is you might create these subtle broadcasts that happen to come down in somebody's neighborhood, and maybe you're somebody like Michael Rivera and you're sensitive to this, and so you start having maybe some kind of a hallucinatory experience. So this could be used for some kind of mind control technology perhaps, or mood control. But the most destructive would be probably what we think of as Tesla's death ray, that you can focus a beam that creates such an imbalance in the ionosphere that eventually you have a big discharge like a lightning bolt that's the size of a city that could just vaporize a town in the blink of an eye. And so there are all these things that could be done with HARP. And so it's not that surprising that I guess I'm going to say about 10 years after HARP debuted, scientists started traveling to Puerto Rico and saying, you guys have this big, really cool dish sitting here that you're listening to stuff with. This would make a hell of a transmitter. And so they, of course, were looking for funding and to stay relevant. And so Arecibo was then turned into an official ionospheric research outpost, what a lot of people just call an ionospheric heater. And what that means is they started doing exactly the same thing at Arecibo that they were doing with HAARP. There was a scientist from Penn State who was one of the leading people helping to set this up. And he said that by the time they would send these transmissions from that dish, that they would easily be sending, 600,000 watts. And for people who don't know what that means, some of these giant radio stations in the old days that were like 150,000 watts, they would broadcast up and down an entire coastline, like the West Coast or the East Coast. So you magnify that many, many, many times and then focus it on a little area that might be 2 to 6 inches in diameter. It's incredible. I went to the Arecibo station one time, and I've been there many times, and I talked to a staff member, and I think she slipped up and told me a little bit too much because they were joking about what would happen when birds would fly over and how they would just explode, and how they would say, well, we don't need to cook our Thanksgiving dinner. We just turn on the transmitter here. So the point is, this is a death ray. And so however it's being used, the opportunity to use this thing as a death ray is there. And so it makes sense, of course, that this island is perfectly positioned so that it is able to receive and send transmissions to a very large cone of the sky. And we're out here in the middle of nowhere, so it's easier to control who knows what's happening here. This island has always been fought over as the gateway to the New World by the English, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, and of course now the Americans were the latest invaders. So there are a lot of things that are all combined here, which in many ways are indeed implicated in this Arecibo positioning and the things that are happening with that observatory.
Joshua P. Warren is our guest, and we're continuing our talk about Puerto Rico and the strange happenings that are taking place there. There are so many different types of activity that are taking place in and around that area. So many different people witnessing these type of phenomena out there. Why do you think there's not a heavier military presence? I mean, this sounds like we're sitting on a portal.
Well, there is a heavy military presence. And, that's one thing that you can't help but notice when you stay here for a long time. I mean, when I first started coming here, a lot of people did not trust me. And they were like, who is this gringo who is here asking all these questions about, secret things and paranormal things? Because, I'm a fairly young guy. I'm 6'2". I keep my hair cut pretty short. A lot of people would tell me that they had been approached in the past by guys who look a lot like me, who were there to intimidate them and say, you don't ever talk about this or that. And so it took a long time of me sticking around and having people sort of find out more about who I was to gain their trust. And there was one lady in particular named Margarita, who is a retired Navy officer. And she's been very, very helpful at sort of vouching for me. But what you find is that, there are a lot of people here who are working with the military in one way or another. And what makes it even weirder is when you talk to some of the authority figures here who say that they don't even know who some of these people are with. For example, I was in a town, it was actually the same town I was mentioning earlier, called La Parguera, and I struck up a conversation with a policeman. And this fella has been a policeman here for over 20 years. And he told me and my wife, Lauren, that there are times when some kind of an incident occurs and that he will receive orders from his supervisors and stuff to just not get involved, and that they will go to areas where he says all these Humvees will pull up. There are all these guys who get out in fatigues, or sometimes they're just in like black sort of SWAT-like outfits. They all have machine guns. and they'll run around and they don't know, what these people are doing, but they are in charge. And the funny thing is, I say, I'm like, well, don't they have any kind of emblems or, is there some type of insignia? And the policeman says, no. He says they don't have any insignias or emblems to illustrate who they are. All we are told is that these people are in charge, defer to them. And he said they are the highest authority on the island and nobody knows who the heck they are. So, and he's not the only person to tell me that. Many, many people have told me that. So I have no doubt that frequently I will go sit down at a bar and think I'm just there for a leisurely experience. And then some guy will sit down next to me who starts asking me all these kind of unusual questions. And I realize, well, this is one of those guys. It's like sometimes if I go to a bar and I'm the only person at the bar, and then some guy comes in and has the whole bar to choose from where he wants to sit, and he just comes over and sits next to me, automatically you're like, well, that's kind of weird, why? And then inevitably these conversations turn to asking me about UFOs and stuff like that, which people don't just bring that up randomly to you. You know that. We've been in this field long enough. And so, there's no telling how many times I have had them sort of want to know what I know and what I'm up to. And these stories that I tell on shows like yours and Coast to Coast AM and Speaking of Strange, and I, as a matter of fact, I have a new free short daily podcast that I started recently called Joshua P. Warren Daily, which I just distribute directly. So there's nobody editing me. There's nobody censoring me. All that's on my website. When you have a guy like me who's coming back to the English-speaking media and reporting on this stuff, which otherwise never leaves the island because it's either mainly discussed in Spanish or people are intimidated to, try to even get the word out. I mean, I'm breaking a lot of ground here just because that I'm able to breach that gap from things that are happening on this little island out here in the middle of nowhere in another language that's not even a state, that has no real rights. And I'm able to, because of my friendship with people like you, get on these airwaves and let people know what's happening here. And another thing that's really fascinating about this island in general is that you have a lot of what they call syncretic traditions here. Now, here's what that means. Of course, the original people who inhabited this island were what they call the Arawak Indians, and they came over, so they say, from like Central and South America. And then they morphed into a tribe called the Igneri, and then eventually they morphed into the Taínos. And the Taínos were the people living here on this island when Columbus came here in 1493 on his second voyage to the New World. And so you have the indigenous native culture here and the spiritualism that they had. And then we had the Spaniards coming over here and, as usual, enslaving people and doing a bunch of horrible stuff in the name of Christianity. And then when the Spaniards worked the Taínos basically to extinction, building these forts and stuff, then they went to Africa and they brought all these black slaves over from Africa. And those slaves would bring with them their traditions like Ifa and some things that we might think of as more oriented toward like voodoo and brujeria and all that. But they couldn't express all of that. So often they would hide it within Christian symbology and iconography. So what you have here on this island is this mix of people now from different backgrounds who have different belief systems. And you never know when you're talking to somebody exactly what that person's belief system is going to be. Most people will at very least pretend that they are Catholic. But again, that doesn't mean that they are literally going to be out there practicing it. They might have a little altar at their house with their own, voodoo or whatever. And so one of my good friends here is a Santero who has lived here for 25 years, I guess. And he's very open talking to me about what he does. And his name is Santero Longley. He is, I guess he's getting close to 80 now, and he lives near San Juan. And he has really given me a lot of in-depth access and information regarding the magical culture that you find here as well. And he said that when you practice what he practices, he's a priest of Ifa, which is an African Yoruba tradition, that you have these gods and goddesses that sort of represent you. And they call those orishas. And he has an orisha called Oya. And she represents the wind and the seas and the storms that come in. So he said when this hurricane came, that Oya was not happy. She was ticked. But nonetheless, him being a priest, a santero, he created what he called a cocoon of protection all around himself and his home and his loved ones, and was unscathed. I mean, he went out even in the middle of the hurricane to take his dog out. He said the wind would almost blow you to the ground, but he still, was fine. And so a lot of people here, they are tapping into these sort of magical traditions and interpreting what you or I might look at technologically as something more spiritual and magical. And as you know, Dave, I'm producing a big event in May in Las Vegas, which is also based on the idea of taking people's personalities and matching it up with a technique that you might consider magical that works for them. So I know at some point we're going to get into that. But and I'd like to give some examples of these different personality types.
Please.
But it reminds me a lot of what the Yoruba tradition has, where you match people up with their orishas.
Fascinating stuff. You're always on the cutting edge, always pushing the boundaries. I love that about working with you and knowing you and the things that you bring to the show. I know time is getting away from us here, so let's make sure we cover what's going on with this program, what you're doing, and let people know what they can do to see it and be a part of it.
Well, thank you, because I believe the last time that I was on the show, I was telling you about my work with paracymatic sigils, where I was taking different tones and frequencies and turning them into patterns in water and using those patterns to experiment with what people might call magical effects.
Right.
And I still have a lot of work to do. I'm building a whole laboratory that's going to be devoted to really exploring that later this year. And so I mention that because I've never demonstrated live how I do this stuff before, but I'm going to be doing it at my big event. This is a 3-day event in May in Las Vegas. It's a one-time only event. Only 100 tickets will be sold. It is at the MGM's Excalibur Hotel right there on the Vegas Strip. It's 3 days to teach you how to hack reality, and it's called Finding Your Magic. So let me explain what that means. Simply, I'm going to be teaching techniques that you might say will help you like beat the system and improve your luck in life and all that. But here are the two ways of explaining this. I have always been a very vivid dreamer, and I mean that literally. Like I go to sleep and I have all these very clear, colorful dreams. And sometimes most of the time I don't know I'm dreaming, but sometimes I realize I'm dreaming, and of course that's called a lucid dream. And when you realize that you're dreaming, suddenly you're able to control the dream, and you can have a lot of fun with it. It's almost like playing a video game at that point. Well, I'm here to tell everybody listening to your show right now that you are dreaming right now. You may not realize it, but this state that you're calling reality is just another form of the dream. And so what I've done is put together a program here to help you become lucid, because you will be amazed at how much you can control and manipulate all of this much more than you think. Now, what I realized over the years is when I would talk to different types of people and do experiments and exercises with them, and I would say, hey, what do you think about, say, using a wishing machine in order to try to manipulate reality? Some people would say, well, that seems cool, but I don't want to use a wishing machine because I don't like things with knobs and buttons, and it just looks too technical. But I think magic wands are cool. And you're like, okay. So then you talk to somebody who uses magic wands, and they're very happy, but somebody else says, no, I don't like wands. I like using the mental techniques of the Force. Somebody else might just say, no, all I do is pray. A lot of people don't think that's a form of magical thinking, but it is. Then you have people out there who say, look, nothing ever works for me. Nothing. I've tried it all. It's all hooey. And a lot of these people don't believe in anything. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in destiny. They just, maybe they believe in technology, but that's it. And it occurred to me, a lot of people, they try to figure out how to get involved in this process of improving their lives by manifesting things and manipulating reality, but they start off on the wrong foot. They get frustrated, they throw up their hands, and they give up. So I started studying all these different personality types, and I studied personality tests. I studied Western astrology, Eastern astrology. I did my own surveys, and I came up with 12 different categories of what you could call personalities. And maybe that's not the right word. I'm not sure. Maybe there's a better word than personality, but I think that at least makes you sort of understand where I'm coming from. And what I found is that you can match those personalities up with a certain type of exercise that is most likely going to work immediately for that person. And so for 3 days, I'm going to be personally going through, helping everybody find out what type they are. I'm going to be matching them up with exercises that will blow their minds. We're going to be in Vegas, so you should be able to go right out there and win money to prove that you're doing this properly. I'm going to have the live paracymatics demo. I've got some UFO crash debris that has never before been made public. I'm going to bring that. I'm going to unveil it and let everybody play with that. Literally, you'll get to handle this stuff. Dr. John Alexander is going to be my guest, my featured guest, and a lot of people call him Colonel John Alexander. He's one of the men who stares at goats.
We just had him on the show, I think 2 weeks ago, Tim?
Yeah, about that. Yeah.
Oh, fascinating guy. George Clooney played him in the movie, for God's sake.
Right.
He's going to be talking about remote viewing and telekinesis. We just have so much stuff stuffed into this 3 days. Plus, there are a lot of people who've been wanting to go to Vegas anyway so that they can go visit our buddy Zach Bagan's new haunted museum. And have you been there yet, Dave?
I have not.
Oh, my gosh. He floored me. I knew that Zach was going to put together something impressive, but I wasn't expecting this. I've been there twice now. Once before he opened, I got to go there, and we shot some stuff for the show, and then I went back after they opened and just went in as a regular customer and went through the whole experience. And this mansion he has is just this huge, rambling mansion that goes on and on and on. And it is full of some of the freakiest stuff that you've ever seen, things that I would not ever want to own. Because, I myself have a museum in Asheville, North Carolina. Zach, he doesn't care if it's like some kind of serial killer stuff, or if here's the cauldron that Ed Gein boiled everybody's bones in and stuff. He will buy whatever kind of freaky, creepy, unnerving thing he can and put it in there and make you sign a waiver before you go in. So this is not for everybody. But if you're the type of person who's into that kind of stuff, then you'll get to go there, and I'll probably go with you, as a matter of fact, and I'll maybe add a little to that experience. So there's a lot of stuff that we're packing into this 3 days. And before I give you some examples of personality types, anybody who wants to go, again, there's only 100 tickets, and they're selling very quickly, as you can imagine. If you go to youwillmanifest.com, that'll take you directly to all the info. You can get all the specifics. You can watch me talking about this in a little video. You can even make payments if you don't have enough money to buy your ticket right now. There's a payment plan, youwillmanifest.com, and I'm going to be right there for 3 days with you, taking you through this. So I'll give you an example of like a personality type. Right now, I'd like for everybody listening to this, without thinking much about it, just take your hands and just clasp your hands together with your fingers interlocked, and then look down and see which thumb is on top. Because some people will have that left thumb on top, some people will have the right thumb on top, and if you reverse it, it doesn't feel right. Now, here's what that means. We know for a fact that the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body and vice versa. So that means if your left thumb is on top, then the right side of your brain is dominant, and vice versa. So if your right thumb is on top, your left side of the brain is dominant.
All right.
So
now, my right thumb is on top. Let me find out what that
thumb
means. Yes, it does. Okay.
And Tim, have you done this?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Which thumb is on top for you?
Left one.
Okay. My left thumb is on top. So
here
Dave,
we go.
You're right.
That's going to be the bigger brain people are left.
We're the smart guys. David.
Yeah, I can sense this coming.
What we have found is that people who have the left thumb on top tend to be better at remote viewing exercises. And so that's one of the things that we would do is we would teach you how to start working on the remote viewing. And so there are 12 different types of personalities. One is called the techno, one is the force bender, one is the name seer, we have a spellcaster, we have the RV, which is the remote viewer, we have the PK, the dowser, the psionic, the scepter. There are all these different types.
Sounds like a new wave of Dungeons and Dragons. I am a 12th level seducer.
Yeah, well, that'd be a nice category. And also what we do is we're analyzing people's personality. So, let's say, for example, that we say, let's evaluate your best attributes and your worst attributes. So, for example, if someone on the good hand is tolerant, intelligent, well-respected, but the bad side is they're also short-tempered and often disinterested, then that person will most likely fit into the type we call the name seer. And this is a person who has great success using a manifestation strategy called true name. So at the event, we'll explain what that means. We'll put you in a station where you'll be able to work on these exercises and you'll be instructed on the proper way to do it so that you start getting results and have this kind of jarring moment where you say, oh my God, this actually works. I can do things that I didn't realize I could do. And we're going to have a lot of hands-on stuff there, PK wheels and just many, many different types of devices to help you get started on the right foot so that you start having success and it inspires you. So obviously I could go on and on about this, but the reason I'm cutting this off at 100 people is because I want to have that personal interactive time with everybody. I want everybody to go home with their lives changed. So hopefully I'll get a lot of your listeners to join me there. YouWillManifest.com will take you straight to the page. And this is a one-time only thing, so I expect that if you feel like you're supposed to be there, you're chosen for this, you better do it.
All right, I'm signing up.
Good. I hope so.
I'd like to.
You'd love it. I know you would love it. I mean, you're a natural for this. You and Tim both.
No, he's Mr. Left Thumb on top. I don't want to be alienated. The two of you guys, you left thumbers, will be leaving me out in the cold. Hey, where's Dave? He's a right thumber. Forget him then.
Well, what I find is that everybody has one thing that they're good at, and that's why I say, what we're doing here is we're introducing you to that one thing that's going to give you the highest chances of success so that you don't give up and you keep going. And I think that lucid living is achieved by receiving knowledge that you didn't realize you could receive, by creating tulpas and thought forms, by creating sympathetic resonance. When I was talking about my book, Use the Force, I said if you were an engineer, you would describe all this as sympathetic resonance, that you have a guy who walks into a room that's empty except for a couple of pianos, and he bangs a chord on one piano and the other piano plays the same chord. Now, they're not attached, but that vibration comes out and it hits the other one and it activates a corresponding signal. You can do this with tuning forks where you strike one tuning fork, and if you have another tuning fork nearby of the same key, it will also start to ring. And this is the basic form of broadcasting. And so what we're doing is we're teaching you in a very effective way of transmitting your mold really out there that is going to activate a corresponding frequency that will come back. because we know that everything in the world is really just an energy mold that physical matter snaps into and shapes into. So if you've ever tried any of these things, if you've tried remote viewing or dowsing or a wishing machine or using a wand or even for that matter praying or any of these things that have just never worked for you, then you just haven't found the right place to start that's going to match up with how your brain works. And if you're one of these people who doesn't believe in anything, that's fine, because you still can take somebody who is a strict material, rational scientist who doesn't believe in anything, who studies medicine and psychology and all that, who will tell you there is this thing called the placebo effect. And we don't know how it works, but it works. And sometimes you give somebody a sugar pill and it works better than if you give them this drug. So even scientists have to admit that there is this wiggle room there where we are able to manipulate our experience of reality, even if we can't explain exactly how we're doing it.
Good stuff. I wish you a lot of success with that. And again, we'll put up a link to that on our website and on our podcast today, so it'll be easy to find, youwillmanifest.com. Josh, thanks for stopping by, man. It's always great to catch up with you.
Well, thank you so much, because I always love, as you know, when we talk, we're able to go through just a gigantic spectrum of good material very quickly. So congratulations on the continued success of this show, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
All right, take care. That's it for this week, or today, I should say. Boy, I'm already shooting to the end of the week, Tim. It's one of those days. My mind is already trajectory. I guess I'm manifesting the end of the week.
I guess you are.
This is the end of today. We'll be back again tomorrow with more of the best in paranormal talk radio. For Tim Dennis, I'm Dave Schrader. You've been listening to Beyond the Darkness.